Waiting on Payday 3 felt like it lasted a lifetime. Rumblings of a sequel as early as 2015 turned into a decade of Payday 2 development as we waited and waited for a worthwhile successor. That's probably why the year that's passed since its launch in September 2023 feels like it's flown by in the blink of an eye. An anticlimax it still seems like I'm coming down from. The game officially went into brief special edition early access on the 18th of September before officially launching on all platforms 3 days later on the 21st. That's over 365 days ago as of recording. Where has all that time gone? Well, for my part, it's mostly gone into moaning about one feature or another, but for Starbreeze, it's been a period of some serious ups and downs. Mostly the latter sadly, but that's not to suggest the game hasn't grown substantially over the past year. In today's video, I'm not only going to recount a complete timeline of events from Payday 3's pre-launch up until its most recent update, Fear and Greed, I'm also going to hopefully help you answer the dreaded Reddit question, is Payday 3 worth considering for purchase now, a year on from one of the most disastrous launches in gaming history? Let's start at the beginning here. Not necessarily the beginning of development, although that can be a little tricky to pin down depending on who you ask. I mean the beginning of 2023, the so-called Year of Payday, which kicked off the game's marketing cycle up until launch. Oh, and what a start it had. A midnight hype trailer set beside the Brooklyn Bridge, filmed on the eye-catching Under the Surface heist. That got the blood pumping and blasted away any New Year's Day hangover I might have been wrestling with at the time. But then, it was mysteriously quiet from the marketing team for a good 5 months, as Payday 2 still had life in the old dog yet. Evidently, plans were changing, as the next trailer we received was little more than a teaser that more was to come around the Summer Game Fest announcement season. However, behind the scenes, things were moving forwards rapidly. Xbox had landed the exclusive reveal trailer rights for their summer showcase on the 11th of June, tying in with the surprise announcement that the game would be on Game Pass from day one. This was a bit of a coup given the game's PC roots, and likely contributed to the delay in marketing between January and May. The trailer was received reasonably well, although there were two emerging camps of naysayers. Those who thought the game was too similar to Payday 2, failing to innovate on the formula, and those who were worried about the game's slightly shaky and inconsistent presentation, citing strangely uncanny civilian expressions, and at times, a generic Unreal Engine aesthetic that lost some of the charm and soul of its predecessor. A few of my personal fears were assuaged when I was lucky enough to be invited to the UK Gaming Summit at the YouTube offices in London, which took place on the 14th of June with a day-long agenda consisting of creator, sponsor and management talks, with 2 hours in the evening set aside to play a mystery game announced earlier in the week, which I of course knew would be Payday 3. I believe this version of the game was the one internally referred to as the April build. It included the full suite of weapons, masks and outfits, but only the core 4 characters alongside 2 heists, no rest for the wicked, the basic bike heist shown off in the first trailer, and the mysterious Under the Surface art gallery heist. I grabbed an armor bag and was pointed in the direction of the now infamous ammo funnel replenish combo by a developer, heading in with the Rheinfeld pump action and Bison revolver. Whilst the presentation of the skill system completely perplexed me and I struggled to understand how to activate and apply the new buffs, Grit, Edge and Rush, the game still felt incredibly good on a surface level. I vividly remember my first heist, as I'm sure many of you do too. It was a no rest on normal, and despite watching the trailer featuring it on loop, I still managed to get terribly lost in the bank and really struggled to fathom what the game wanted from me, although I was a little shocked by just how few cops I ran into across the heist, coming directly from Payday 2. Regardless, we completed it in roughly 15 minutes before stepping up the challenge on Under the Surface, messing around with more of the new stealth systems, which was an area of the game that felt like it had received the most attention from my initial conversations. Overall, my takeaways were that the game had some presentation issues, but it had laid out the groundwork to be fun and successful. The implication was always that menus and systems would change before launch, so I pushed those concerns to the back of my mind. Just over a week later, I had another chance to stress test the game alongside other Starbreeze partners who invited to the studio in Stockholm to try it out for the first time at the end of the press release event. On the 23rd of June, we flew out and again had the opportunity to try out the April build, this time with other massive Payday enthusiasts with just as much passion for the game. Looking back at it now, there were plenty of red flags to pick up on. There was this tacit concern around the scope of launch content, criticism of the clunky UI or HUD was met with steady confirmations that this was still a work in progress, and concerns around the implementation of weapon stats, customization, and a pure challenge leveling system were met somewhat defensively. But as soon as we sunk our teeth into the core gameplay as a group, it was almost impossible not to get lost in a loop of escalating positivity. The excitement was palpable in that room, and in the few hours we had to play, the general vibe was, this is good, I just hope there's more of it, and everything works as it has in this controlled setting. Of course, that wouldn't end up being the case, but the partner videos and for the most part mainstream reviewer feedback when the content embargo lifted on the 26th of June was that Payday 3 was on track for an excellent launch. Payday 3 blew me away. Marion Top Hat, Red Hot Alive, Mortifer, we all had broadly positive things to say about the game, but really lacked the insight or perception to see what was to come. The rest of the summer carried on with the same positive energy though. On July 17th, the stealth trailer showcasing more of Under the Surface launched, hidden in plain sight to further hype up the most evolved new systems that would arrive with the game. Dev blogs were created to offer more insight from those responsible for Payday 3, covering a wide array of key topics, with confirmation that console would be prioritised alongside PC, with key features like crossplay and cross-progression confirmed via the slightly cumbersome Starbreeze Nebula platform they've been touting since 2022. This all came to a marketing head on the 23rd of August at Gamescom's opening night live event, where we received a trailer for a new heist, 99 boxes, the announcement of a new contractor, Mac, who was to be played by Ice-T, and the first piece of live-action Payday content in about 5 years in Follow the Money. Across the board, this was received incredibly well, and Payday 3 followed this up with an excellent Gamescom that I was fortunate enough to attend. The event build that was playable was just a slight variation of the April build, including No Rest for the Wicked but dropping Under the Surface and adding 99 boxes, a bit of a sandbox heist which was easier to pick up and play in the event setting. Payday's gameplay loop was effectively made for conventional halls. The game is tight and engaging for short play sessions, ramping really quickly within minutes of picking it up. Given how popular the Payday 3 booth was, players were given 30 minutes at maximum with the game, meaning they often had just enough time for a full playthrough of whichever heist they chose, and only got to experience the game at its very best. No matchmaking, no repeat playthroughs to expose a lack of RNG, and no account progression, just pure Payday 3 gameplay at its most accessible. It's no wonder the game did incredibly well at the event, taking home 2 Gamescom awards for Best PC Game and Most Entertaining Game on the show floor. Once again, more optimistic signs for launch, now just a couple of months away. And with that in mind, as had been the format for Payday 2 before it, it was finally time to roll out a beta to start testing the game amongst a wider audience. The first technical beta kicked off on the 2nd of August, with only 5,000 initial invites going out. The intention was to test the game's functionality, although the feature upvote system also went live with it, so feedback could be provided. The beta expanded over the rest of the week, allowing more people to access it, but still on an invite-only basis, and the general consensus was tentatively positive. Only No Rest for the Wicked was available to play, but this heist was excellent at showcasing new mechanics in stealth and had a solid flow to it in Loud, highlighting the very best of what combat now offered. With progression capped, players were fairly content with what they were able to get their hands on, barely even noticing the new challenge leveling system, and despite noting some imbalances between weapons like the Ziv Commando and the SA Marksman Rifle, the groundwork was already clearly there for a fun, full game, so long as everything locked was of the same high quality. Pivotally, there weren't any technical issues to write home about outside of a few matchmaking teething pains, which raised confidence amongst the community. I must confess though, at this stage I started to question just how much would be changing from that April build we'd seen a few months prior. With the unfinished UI making it into the beta build, it seemed likely that things weren't exactly where they needed to be. But regardless, No Rest felt like an excellent springboard, and the vast majority of feedback was broadly positive. On September the 7th, in tandem with a peculiar Payday event in New York hosted by Plaion, 2 additional heisters were announced for the launch roster, Joy and Pearl. Whilst I'd pretty much spoiled Joy already by accidentally showing off her poorly hidden classic outfit at Gamescom, it was still an addition players were excited for, especially seeing as it appeared as if Starbreeze had modernised her design and matured her personality. Pearl was even more exciting news, bringing a fresh new character to the series for players to fall in love with, figuratively and quite literally in some cases. Of course, some were disappointed their old favourites from Payday 2 wouldn't be playable at launch, or that the heavily teased Houston somehow hadn't made the cut, but it was a sign that classic heisters would be back, and nothing was outside the realms of possibility, contributing to even more noise and excitement around the game. Just over a week before the early access launch, another beta was announced, again framed as technical in nature, suggesting very little would be changing with the gameplay, which made sense this close to launch. Unfortunately, nothing had changed between betas either, with Starbreeze simply opening up the month-old branch again for additional testers to join, as this time it was open and included specific server slam timings, sold as opportunities to try and break their tech so it could be fixed. This was really well received, as many more people, including those on Xbox I believe, were able to try the game out for free, and it seemed clear that Starbreeze were conscious of the dangers of releasing an online-only game and wanted to be proactive about it. In hindsight, I think this took place far too close to launch to really make a difference, and failed to consider the fact that it was difficult to really slam the servers to the same extent you'd expect from a full release when all we had was one heist and a few weapons to try out. Still, they did manage to break them on multiple occasions. It was easy to spin this as a positive, as that was the entire gimmick of the beta, but in truth, this was just a taste of what was to come when the servers really got slammed. In the meantime, I wasn't able to participate in this second beta, as myself and two other Starbreeze partners, alongside the winner of the Do Time to Get Time competition, were over at the Prison Museum in Gävle, Sweden. This is where the first external private Payday 3 play session was set to take place, but not before a long day of filming for the marketing promo, including a more painful stealth grind than I had expected. After all that, we were exhausted, so looking back at it, weren't in the perfect state of mind to experience all 8 of the game's launch heists for the first time. What I will say is we smashed our way through them all on very hard within the hour and a half or so before we had to leave the museum and it closed for the night. The lingering worry for me was that this game wouldn't have the content to secure a dedicated player base at launch, but in the wake of another positively received beta period, the hope was the game had enough going for it that it didn't matter it was content light, with live service updates just around the corner. However, despite the proactive beta testing, the discourse around the game that wasn't centered purely on its gameplay was starting to become more and more worrying. The core complaints were around the game being always online, the planned addition of microtransactions post-release, and the existence of De Novo, a derided anti-cheat solution that was known to negatively impact game performance. Requiring a permanent online connection was perceived as a double-edged sword. It would limit how and when players could play the game, and meant it all relied upon a single server provider, which was always a risk depending on how they coped with player demand. Concerns were brushed off for the most part, with players growing more agitated and pensive, but in the run-up to launch on the 15th of September, it was announced that De Novo would not be present in the game. This was like a shot to the arm. It didn't make the always online concerns disappear, but it was seen as a massive win which moved the rhetoric in a more positive direction. If we could convince them to drop this, why not microtransactions, was the chatter amongst the community, meaning we headed into the soft early access launch on the 18th with an optimistic spring in our step. The launch itself came at 4 PM BST or 11 AM Eastern, following on from an impressively run community show which acted as a tipping point for the Payday 3 hype meter. As soon as the game went live, it was flooded by the most dedicated players who'd splashed out on more expensive silver and gold editions on all platforms. Game Pass hadn't yet landed, so the player numbers were still under control, peaking at just over 35,000 on Steam, but the initial reception was still above and beyond internal expectations. Reviews for the game were broadly similar to Payday 2's on launch, which added to the optimism around the game. 7s and 8s were the most common scores, and the majority of critique was around its slightly formulaic gameplay that didn't overly transcend its predecessors, as well as its limited launch content, especially in terms of unique heists. But as we all knew from our experience with Payday 2, these things come with time. Heists can up their ambition and scope post-launch, and that was clearly the plan for Payday 3 as well. I had some concerns around the game's difficulty, as we were able to clear every heist on Overkill within the first 5 hours of launch, but otherwise was still having a blast. Stealth was refined, and although the heists were simple, they were visually striking and enjoyable on initial playthroughs. Unfortunately though, it wasn't all rosy. PlayStation players had already been let down, with the beta build launching instead of the release version, meaning the only available heist was still no rest for the wicked. This was handled quite swiftly, but was an initial sign that Starbreeze still had difficulties managing console editions. Regardless, those 3 days were probably peak Payday 3 for the majority of us involved. Outside of the console woes, most things worked from a technical perspective, and we were so caught up in the honeymoon period of new systems and shiny looking weapons and heists, we didn't get to see their repetitive flaws or poor balance. Skills were a bit of a sticking point early on, with many players struggling to understand how they functioned and why it felt like they were reinventing the wheel, but there was still plenty of time to iron out these teething pains. Crucially, over those first few days, progression felt absolutely fine. Players had plenty of challenges to complete and would do so passively whilst playing the game however they wanted to. Those of us looking to level up at a faster rate paid attention to them, but in all honesty, the weapon challenges were fine, giving us something to chase and encouraging more build experimentation. There was a real ignorance is bliss situation going on here. Most things seemed to work, anything that didn't appear like an easy fix, especially if we were going to get a day one patch for the full release, as was widely anticipated. The story was a bit uninspired and the heist roster slightly limited, but this all seemed like the beginning of something special, and the community sentiment during those first few days was broadly positive. Of course, looking back at it now, this is hardly a surprise. It was only the most hardcore fans of the series who paid up for early access, so the game had credit in the bank with most of us. It's also fair to say the vast majority of Payday 3's issues start to arise as your playtime increases. It always was a solid game for those first 10 hours, that's why it did so well at Gamescom, but the cracks begin to show as you wear out its rigid systems over time, and that time came rather abruptly with the full release on September the 21st. Rolling into launch, I'd called the game a rough diamond, lacking content, needing some refinement and improved variation, but still a worthy successor to Payday 2. Alas, nothing prepared me for the rug that was pulled out from under us next. The first 45 minutes of the global launch were bliss. Player numbers skyrocketed on Steam, and there must have been tens of thousands logging in on other platforms too. But just moments after tweeting out their dominance on the Steam charts, it all went wrong. Nebula errors for everyone. The servers were more than just slammed, and it seemed as though neither Starbreeze employees nor those working for the server provider had the resources or know-how to get things back up for good. No sooner than there was good news and players hopped on, we were back to square one. This was actually the point at which Starbreeze comms were seemingly gagged, trying not to do more harm than good by directly addressing the community, barely giving an update on the state of things over the next few days as the situation got more and more dire. There were brief patches of hope when things worked, but for the most part it was an unmitigated disaster. The game was review bombed, players refunded it in their droves, and online, Payday 3's name was mud, known as the heisting game that's so immersive it steals your money too. Unfortunately, this will be the prevailing perception for years to come, I fear, regardless of what happened next. In truth, from a creator perspective, there was still a small tinge of optimism that once the servers worked, the game should still have legs once updates started rolling out. But honestly, I now believe the technical nightmare at launch really just distracted from the game's core issues. Without it, I don't think we would have seen such a drastic player number drop-off over the preceding weeks and months, but I also don't know if that would have just led to Starbreeze going full ostrich mode and burying their heads in the sand to all the other complaints that came to the fore in the wake of the server crisis. I wonder if the game was allowed to cruise by with middling reviews and a semi-sustainable player base, we might not have seen the necessary sweeping changes we eventually would thanks to Operation Meditbag. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. In the timeline of events, it took a couple of weeks of brutal server instability before the game worked consistently again, helped by the fact that we weren't even close to troubling the Steam charts anymore, meaning the servers could actually cope, already dropping to a peak less than 50% its initial figures by the start of October. At that point, the already fed up player base started to find holes in the game. Not only was content limited, it was also repetitive. Progression was frustrating and encouraged regressive gameplay. Nebula was still causing problems and players were struggling to play together or communicate. The complete lack of social functionality in a co-op focused game was disastrous when it came to building a coherent community. That's not even getting into the more grassroots gameplay complaints players had. Seeded RNG added to the monotony, AI teammates were totally insufficient, and build variety was non-existent, with the hardest difficulties being solved within days once the game worked. The chatter around Payday 3 barely innovating on the Payday 2 formula remained, but now a new camp was emerging who believed the game had taken steps backwards, dropping core features like CrimeNet and a server browser, which gave its predecessor its unique style and functionality, in favour of cloning the modern military shooter approach. The perceived slowness of the game was now thrust under the microscope as players had concerns, with the new plate-based armor system also facing a lot of scrutiny. But in the face of this mounting wall of critique, often spearheaded by voices of veterans of the series, there was no word of an official update. Members of the production and community teams, such as Andreas and Almir, faced the music on stream, adding a channel of communication to soak up feedback, but the information was only travelling in one direction, meaning all we ever heard was how this has been noted or that's on the table. The first official patch, initially slated for October the 5th, was delayed, containing key bug fixes, but not really addressing the community concerns anyway. This delay would be a recurring issue for the game, seemingly caused by Microsoft and Sony certification requirements, something Starbreeze just wasn't used to dealing with, as Payday 2 had been a Steam-focused game since launch. Again, inexperience and overambition seemed to be costing them dearly. Regardless of the core issues the game faced, day by day the community was finding more ways to break it, trivializing it further and completely breaking the economy. The weapon XP bug on 99 boxes, C-stack duplication glitch caused by server delay, and a myriad of ways to break guards' AI and stealth. Then there was all the missing content, favors that weren't properly implemented, and voice lines that never played. Version 1.0 of Payday 3 was a mess that got worse and worse the longer the community had to tear it apart. Hell, I even made a challenge video to draw attention to these serious problems and the desperate need for an update, which finally came almost a month later than planned. Version 1.01 was advertised as having over 100 individual bug fixes, but not a whole lot else. If you didn't enjoy the game before it, you weren't likely to after it, with only very minor changes that failed to move the needle for the Steam player base, now down in the low thousands. Many of the core glitches were fixed, but far too late to save the economy and weapon progression, which was another system the community was generally unimpressed by. As for those exploits related to gameplay, it felt as if every new patch just added more even after addressing the old ones. But at the very least, it was proof the game could be updated and could start moving forward. Sentiment was low, but not quite rock bottom, so the team looked to capitalise a couple of weeks later with the first dev update, announcing 2 free classic heists that were being reimagined for Payday 3. Update 2 was heavily marketed by the team, seen as a potential launchpad to change the trajectory of the game. Cookoff took one of the most iconic Payday mechanics and looked to add some much needed replayability and length to a heist, whilst Turbid Station, a remake of Murky Station, was the game's first stealth-only experience, which gave the designers a chance to experiment with the most well-received elements of the game, those being the new stealth mechanics. Alongside these sizable free additions, the update which launched on November the 30th included the return of Locke as a contractor, the start of the great work done by the animation team on first-person animations, a new level cap and endgame progression system known as Renown, and finally a skill line known as Transporter, which finally allowed you to stack and carry 2 bags at a time, rapidly becoming a staple on everyone's build, which had me wondering why it wasn't just added as a feature instead. In addition, Update 2 was the first that had been developed after receiving feedback from launch, meaning the very first community concession was made. The Challenge XP system remained in place, but was now supported by a new Recommended Challenges tab. In addition to this source of XP though, a new heist completion bonus was added, granting the player additional rewards for simply completing the heist, and doing so while securing all loot or in stealth. This was an undeniably fantastic update, although given how low sentiment was heading into it, it still managed to stir up some controversy. Players were confused as to why remasters were already coming to the game instead of fresh new heisting experiences, and after losing so much goodwill at launch, the assumption seldom gave Starbreeze the benefit of the doubt. Accusations of asset reuse, creative bankruptcy, and corner cutting were rife, despite these genuinely being lovingly remade from the ground up. Unfortunately, all that TLC didn't mean they functioned well within the Payday 3 framework. Cookoff was riddled with game-breaking bugs, which was particularly egregious given how long it took to fully complete. Its drawn-out length also highlighted many of the issues with the death by 1,000 cuts philosophy that was baked heavily into the armor system, not helped by the fact that they nerfed the skill Armor Up in this patch, which was almost universally used to help manage resources. It was a well-considered nerf, but the community already felt pigeonholed into one style of play, which now seemed to be under attack, making the game harder and, for many, more frustrating. This would be a precursor to a much more controversial nerf later in the year. As for Transporter, it's an almost universally loved skill line, but also draws out some of the game's design issues, making heists even faster to speed through, which resulted in an experience that felt more like a job rather than a game. The renown system was targeted at so few in the community, it didn't make a dent in sentiment, and whilst lots of players appreciated the addition of bonus heist experience rewards, it wasn't the full-on overhaul of the progression system that had been called for since about 2 weeks into the game's lifespan. Anything less than a reversion to something resembling Payday 2's system was likely to be viewed as a half measure. Whilst the update drew in a peak of over 5,000 Steam players, what was more alarming was the fact that average player numbers fell to just over 1,000 by November. Another 80% drop from the month prior, which displayed a downward spiral unlikely to be reversed without wholesale change. But at this stage, that wasn't on the minds of any senior leadership at Starbreeze. In fact, the hope seemed to be a return to business as usual. So without skipping a beat, on December the 4th, just 4 days after the last update, Dev Update 2 was released, showcasing the third update the game would shortly be receiving, including the first of the 4 planned Year 1 DLCs. On one hand, it was great to see consecutive updates announced after the month and a half of nothing at launch. On the other, no one seemed to read the room, as releasing paid content whilst your game is deemed to be in a shambolic state is hardly a good look. This was of course pre-sold content via the gold, silver and special editions of the game, but the timing couldn't be worse, hot on the heels of what felt like an apology update in Update 2. Despite the lukewarm community release, the Syntax Error DLC launched on December the 12th, following the modern Payday 2 DLC format of including a heist completable in stealth and loud, a weapon pack featuring 3 new guns, and a tailor pack with 4 new suits, gloves and masks. The free component of this update was really quite limited, including a few free cosmetics and the Scrambler skill line, which was centered around tools and ECM jammers, making it more geared for stealth and not as universally popular as Transporter before it. On the plus side, it added armor repair kits designed to make the meta armor playstyle less dependent on the armor bag equipment, although it would be some time before there were enough supporting skills and mechanics to really make these work. With the free content being as limited as it was clear Starbreeze's hopes for this one was in its DLC additions, which were all high quality. The Syntax Error heist was a big step up in scope from the base game offering, the weapons added were all high quality, with the animation team doing a huge amount of heavy lifting once again, and the cosmetics were much appreciated given the sparse set of options at launch. Syntax Error even included a brand new enemy to the Payday series in the first female special unit, the Techie. She added some completely new mechanics to the heist that were incredibly interesting, although at launch she was outright overpowered to the point where she slightly butchered the Syntax Error experience on her own. In spite of the Techie being a nuisance, Syntax was an objectively well-designed heist, although there was one major sticking point that the player base couldn't get over: its asking price. This DLC was selling as a bundle for roughly £15 or $18, which for reference was almost half of its $40 price tag on launch. This was simply unacceptable to the community, so despite the obvious quality and time that had been dedicated to crafting this DLC pack, the prevailing message was to not buy at this ludicrous price. The small mercy for fans was that Syntax Error as a heist was at least playable without ownership by joining an active lobby hosted by someone else, as had been the case with Payday 2 before it. Although without a functional method to browse and join lobbies, this could hardly be called a mitigating factor. In the wake of Update 1.1's middling reception, and what seemed like more cash-grabbing behaviour from Starbreeze, even the winter holidays and seasonal storefront sales couldn't do much to turn things around. Average players on Steam rose to 1,500 again, but the peak never matched the 5,000 who tuned in for the Legacy Heist release on the 30th of November, suggesting that interest was starting to wane at a moment that leadership surely hoped would be a turning point. Once again, there's a small part of me that's thankful this was the case. If they got away with a solid December and first DLC launch, the rest of the year would have likely been business as usual. But instead, after 3 months of disappointment following a financially successful launch in spite of refunds, Starbreeze leadership was finally forced to pay full attention. Step 1 took place on the 21st of December, just prior to the winter break, as senior Payday 3 designer Miodrag Kovacevic was publicly promoted to the role of game director, which had been a vacant position following the temporary departure of Eric Winevi. Mio was the most public-facing member of the development team outside of the community department, and whilst he wasn't a universally adored figure, he was still a known quantity, and this appointment would surely give the game a clearer direction to move in instead of being seemingly rudderless. However, he was still stepping into a burning building at this stage in the game's life. The downward spiral that had occurred since the 21st hadn't been halted, and unless perception of the game was turned on its head, it was very unlikely it could ever recover to hit the internal targets set before launch, which is why much of January was set aside to take stock and plan for the road ahead. For us fans though, the silence was deafening. After the flurry of activity heading into Christmas, the new year was notably barren. Outside of a content sneak peek stream which showcased a new health playstyle and plans to up the hardest difficulty, all we knew was Starbreeze were finally looking to gather feedback for a larger announcement coming in February. From a player perspective, this is the most dead the game has ever been. Player numbers dropped even further, averaging less than 300 by February, as it became almost impossible to find an online lobby in this co-op-centric game, not helped by its dreadful matchmaking system. Even as the news broke on February the 15th of the Payday 3 revitalization project, Operation Medit Bag, with none of the planned overhauls being implemented until later into the year, February through May became a real low point in the game's cycle. But although it was just words on the page at this stage, OMB did feel like a last roll of the dice that really could save and secure this game's future. The key takeaway from a solemn Almir-fronted video and website post was that the game was going to be overhauled with a focus on core community issues, and whilst that might slow down the release of additional heist and DLC content, that would be in favour of creating a game actually worth dropping those heists into. It all sounded good on paper, with sweeping changes coming to progression, matchmaking in the UI, as well as a solo offline mode that would be implemented across the year to solve the issue of always online. DLCs were being pushed to later in the year instead of launching quarterly, and the pricing model was being reconsidered, whilst the plans to move to Unreal Engine 5 and add an in-game microtransaction store was shelved until 2025 at the earliest. In an attempt to improve communication, weekly blog posts were also to be produced every Friday to keep the community in the loop and tease upcoming content before it was ready for launch. Just about everything detailed around Operation Medit Bag was a net positive in the community's eyes, but until it was more than just words on a page, it was difficult to really get excited, and that was reflected by the player base over the next few months. Pessimism was rife, as blog posts were derided for being irrelevant as the team scrambled to find topics to discuss, whilst under the corporate gaze of Plyon, who didn't want to risk any more overpromising and under-delivering scandals. It didn't help that the first Operation Medit Bag editions completely failed to make an impact on the community. Update 1.1.1, releasing on February the 29th, was widely derided as a milquetoast start to this supposed redemption arc. Outside of buffs to the R900 sniper rifle and Moscone, as well as an all-important nerf to the techie who'd been running rampant, making Syntax Error almost unplayable for 2 months, there wasn't a lot to write home about at a crucial juncture when the community was most receptive to OMB, but remained skeptical to the efficacy of this new initiative. The icing on the cake was the touting of the new Lobby Unready function like it was the second coming of Bane. As a result, the update made players even more wary of what OMB was trying to achieve. In fact, this coupled with the past 5 months since Payday 3 release was enough to see Starbreeze CEO Tobias Sjogren step down from his leadership role, amicably handing it over as an interim solution was put in place, which still hasn't been fully resolved as of the time of writing, as CFO Matt Yule is currently filling the position. This showed just how dire the situation internally actually was, with Tobias likely taking the brunt of the blame for the server fiasco at launch and passive approach to turning the ship around in the intervening months. Fortunately though, the March update, which went live 2 weeks later on the 27th, was a real step up for the game. Whilst it failed to address many of the more macro concerns players had, it did finally shake up the meta, although not entirely for the better. Adaptive armor was added to somewhat emulate Payday 2's armor, as it didn't take permanent damage throughout a heist. Medit bags were massively buffed, whilst a new overheal mechanic called Adrenaline was added to give a proper alternative to just focusing on armor. The new skill line, Fortitude, lent into this playstyle and quickly made it the go-to approach for most high-level players, which was easy to spec into as the max skill point cap was also increased to 28 from 21 at level 100. Not to mention, after recent buffs to Manipulator, a new skill Clean Slate designed to buff armor repair kits, and finally inexplicable buffs to Precision Shot and Cutting Shot, all of a sudden just about everything was viable, and the hardest difficulty, Overkill, was now a walk in the park. Even the Ziv Commando received some love. This was the most buff-heavy patch I can remember reviewing, even across the long history of Payday 2. The end result was running around with a semi-indestructible build for the next few weeks, which was at least a fun change of pace that pleased players who thought the game was too slow at launch. But it wasn't exactly sustainable, as the novelty wore off fairly rapidly, and what replay value could be derived from the game's difficulty was now completely out the window. Again, 1 month later, on the April the 30th, all too delayed to stop the rot that set in after the previous update, 1.1.3 released. This update wasn't focused around rebalancing the game, so adrenaline lovers were left indestructible. Instead, it was more about functionality. It re-added the highly requested quick play feature, which had been present in the first ever beta. This was rudimentary, with no way to filter by heist or approach, but it did simplify the process of finding an active online squad, which was much appreciated. The Party Up option was also added alongside this to help you make friends, but this was hardly enough when half the community were gagged by console policy. This update also added the free shot grenade, which was one of the first tangible content additions for a while that was purely well received, as well as the ability to enter the boot of the escape van, just like old times. But with these updates bringing very little new to experience, the flow of returning players who'd hop on to at least check out the game was dwindling, hitting an all-time low Steam average of only 243 players in April and a peak of just 518 hopping on to try out 1.1.3. I suppose there's only so alluring you can make the back of an escape van. In fact, the largest takeaway from the update by the creators within this community was the fact that Vlad's likeness had been inexplicably changed to no longer resemble his voice actor, Ilya Volok. Surely not fancying a lawsuit at this moment in time. Still, the community that remained was trying to rally for the game, hosting monthly community events which were now supported by the Starbreeze community team via in-game bonus reward events, but that didn't prevent a slow start to May. But again, almost a month to the day on from the April update, update 1.1.4 was announced and released rapidly on the 29th. This was comfortably the most ambitious OMB patch so far. It completely revamped progression, doing away with the challenges altogether in favour of larger heist, loot bag and stealth multipliers, which also massively increased the rate at which you could level your account up. For most players this was a huge relief, although it didn't take long for the hardcore community to completely crack the renowned system and hit max level, reducing the content they had to play around with. Rotating loud modifiers were added alongside 2 new stealth modifiers, despite community feedback suggesting they needed more time to be refined. While some of these were well received and helped make the game harder, many were just viewed as frustrating, and lacking the ability to opt out of playing with them on higher difficulties was controversial. On a more positive note, the Mask of the Week system was added to provide the community with a rotating array of new cosmetics they could purchase, encouraging more frequent logins, whilst a new skill line, Assassin, was added to help get more out of throwables and silencers, whilst also somewhat emulating the grinder lifesteal playstyle which had been so popular in Payday 2. The techie had not been particularly received well over on Syntax Error, but she was still rolled out across all heists in this patch, alongside a new counter-hacking drone designed to disrupt your active skills. On the whole, the community's concerns were unfounded, as she was exceptionally well implemented and added a new element of much needed difficulty. On the subject of difficulty, a lot of what made the game too easy after 1.1.2 was also finally addressed, with Cutting Shot receiving a nerf which sadly hurt a fair few weapons that relied on its base penetration increase, although the SA Marksman Rifle remained monstrously overpowered, with Precision Shot somehow dodging much of the balanced path, so there were still ways to break the game altogether. This May update was generally well received, with the progression changes alone enough to encourage more than 3 times the number of players to check it out, compared to update 1.1.3, peaking at over 1,600 players on Steam, which was the first notable monthly gain since the rot set in back in January. Whilst challenge progression was never properly supported or given a chance at life, I still think it was a fundamentally flawed idea that came from a lack of understanding of what a Payday player tends to enjoy in their game, and so it's a shame challenges have still not returned in some form to give dedicated players something to chase, but this was still a net win for the game. Update 1.1.5 was released just a week and a half later on the 10th of June, but this one was sadly a glorified hotfix. At the very least, this displayed that updates could be rolled out at a faster rate if content was complete, and it seemed like the team finally had a handle on the console certification process. Also in early June, Starbreeze was quietly starting to test out server infrastructure improvements, looking to find a permanent solution that surely entailed moving away from their initial partner that had struggled so significantly at launch. On June the 18th, a new narrative campaign kicked off, known as the Dragon Files, as the team pulled in a cheap and available fan favourite from Payday 2 to lead the live-action storytelling around the impending updates. That's because, at long last, we were soon to be receiving a new heist, as the team was contractually obligated to launch all 4 DLC packs within year 1 of the game's lifecycle, and time was rapidly running out. Crucially though, the feedback regarding pricing had been taken on board, so the team had managed to drum up some goodwill heading towards the Boys in Blue marketing cycle. The new prices were roughly 33% lower than they had been for Syntax Era back in December, a much more palatable proposition for anyone looking to make an outright purchase. This was obviously a tricky call, as the only reason the first DLC was so expensive was to increase the practical value of owning either Special Edition and buying this content up front. As that wouldn't necessarily be the case with the new pricing model, the solution was to offer retroactive cosmetic compensation items to players depending on their past purchases. Repurposing content was originally planned for the MTX store and using it to pay early adopters back. It actually surprises me how well this approach was received by the community, probably just because the items were pretty nice, although the idea of chucking repurposed items at their most dedicated and loyal players seems a little callous to me. Regardless, it worked to set Boys in Blue up to succeed, at least a lot more than Syntax had before it. What I don't think Starbreeze's executives foresaw was just how ready the community was for the release of the Boys in Blue DLC. What started as a semi-ironic meme posting session straight out of Marina Top Hat's Discord, ending up being a genuinely effective way of getting the news out that there was a new Payday 3 heist on its way, over 6 months since the game's last. Weekend plans were being cancelled left, right and centre, and we were all getting the poison brews in to enjoy Update 1.2.0, which finally launched on June the 27th. Or at least it tried to, as once again its release was marred by technical difficulties that set it back by almost 8 hours, slightly dulling the hype that had been cultivated so organically. In the end, the compensation items were sacrificed to get this update into the hands of the community. On the plus side, it was worth the wait for most. My take is that the long wait between heist releases had left everyone so stir-crazy for new heist content, they could have dropped lab rats on us and we still would have been happy. My personal opinion was that for a heist we waited months for, Boys in Blue was underwhelming, but after more time with it, I have to admit it does have a certain je ne sais quoi. On the whole, the community very much enjoyed the new heist at the police station, and even I have to admit the weapon and cosmetic DLCs that released alongside it were finally worth the cost of admission. This update also offered the first new returning playable character in Clover, entirely for free, alongside an impressive set of new cosmetics, including some that could be unlocked via Twitch drops, and a new LMG which is the first of its kind within the weapon category. Hell, on the OMB front, we even got our first look at solo mode, which was riddled with bugs at this stage, but at least allowed solo players to get into lobbies rapidly, instead of having to wait for a server to be assigned and then having to deal with whatever latency issues came with that constant need for a connection. This was comfortably the largest update of the year so far, bringing with it a large chunk of consolidated content that had been held back, as well as the first baby steps for the most requested feature, offline mode. It failed to address the more core gameplay concerns players had, but was a fun enough distraction most players could get behind. Despite landing so late in the month, it was even still able to increase average player figures significantly from May, peaking at 3,286 on update day, and signalling the start of a true consecutive uptrend for the game. How did Starbreeze celebrate its first tangible momentum shift? By taking July off, of course. In all seriousness, it's commonplace for companies to be highly unproductive around the disruptive summer holiday season, although this idea that the dry July was required by Swedish law is a total misnomer, as it wasn't as though the entire Payday 3 staff were off on company-mandated vacations, it's just that companies in Sweden can't refuse requests for up to 4 weeks of holiday within that period. Anyway, this wasn't the end of the world. In fact, there was a plan in place to ride the sudden surge of Payday 3 goodwill following the Boys in Blue saga, starting with the Mask Mania event. The intention of this one was to get players collectively playing specific base game heists tied to 4 new masks that would be unlocked by all who participated once enough cash was stolen from their associated heists. Not a terrible idea on paper, but in practice it was a half-baked attempt to encourage more logins, with incredibly unrealistic goals, technical blips that made it appear as though the numbers were being fudged, and non-existent in-game marketing for the event. The result was the community only managed to unlock one of the 4 masks, and that was after doubling the rate at which we earned them, as the event spluttered to an embarrassing end, with the external impression being that the game didn't even have the player base to support a community event. A stumble for sure, but not one where the company landed flat on its face. That particular trip came next, as July went from a quiet interlude to a raucous pile-on. Following a tiny hotfix on the 22nd of July, the 2nd of August bore witness to a CrimeFest 2015 level Payday blow-up. In what seemed like an ordinary blog post released every Friday, this time the topic was a planned nerf and repositioning of the popular ammo funnel skill. Starbreeze partners had warned of the repercussions of going after the few distinctive playstyles the game had, and very much didn't hold back in releasing scathing videos which criticised this approach. I'm sure most of you are familiar with what happened next. Regardless of the merits or issues with this plan change, it all imploded over on Twitter, with Mio, who'd now been the game director for over 7 months, pushing back against criticism as his own partner pointed the finger at creators like Red Archer Live for the toxic atmosphere within the Payday community. Check out my drama video released a few weeks back for a more detailed account of proceedings, as I've promised myself I'm not going to delve back into that chapter of Payday history willingly. The upshot was that a large number of community members vocally protested the planned change and viewed Mio's reaction as a damning indictment of his ability to lead the game moving forward. Within a week, the planned change was cancelled and Mio's position remained tenuous. Fortunately, we were at the very least out of the shadow of July, a month that failed to host a new spike in peak Steam player numbers, but still saw a steady rise in concurrence despite the controversy. August was a time for more excitement and new content. In the background, the Boys in Blue DLC had teased the much anticipated return of Houston as the marketing cycle kicked off for the land of the free DLC. Another Dragonfile update gave us more info on Dallas's little brother, all but confirming the new DLC heist would take place at a courthouse, whilst also teasing the possible return of Jacket, one of the most popular heisters across the entire series. We also knew that this upcoming update would include the very first newly designed free heist known as Diamond District, which was heavily inspired by the 4 Stores gameplay loop from Payday 2. On the 19th of August, DLC 3, now renamed Houston Breakout, released, containing another impressive spread of paid content, as well as a solid chunk for those unwilling to splash out. The heist itself was more than competent, and the sheer concept of emulating the ever-iconic Houston Breakout heist was enough to turn some heads, especially of veteran players. The weapon pack was centered around 3-round burst guns, which also added something new to try out, whilst the free weapon, a machine pistol secondary, gave even DLC-less players a unique option to play around with. As for the rest of the free content, Diamond District was a smash hit which lent into its simplicity by giving the player far more control over the heist than we'd become used to in Payday 3. The consumable system was also an interesting addition, allowing players to carry 3 to 5 first aid and armor repair kits around with them for immediate usage. It was a cool idea in concept, again trying to solve the survivability issues players had complained about since launch, but it was yet another addition that made the game much easier. It was paired with nerfs to FAKs, and the over-buffed precision shot skill was finally neutered to the point of becoming almost unusable, but the game was still noticeably easier as of update 1.3.0. From the outside looking in, this was a truly excellent update, adding more in a single patch than we'd ever seen before. Of course, Houston was still not ready for release, which was a little strange as we'd just canonically broken him out, but regardless, this was another massive step. Unfortunately though, it was also another sign of the pressure Starbreeze developers were now under to release all prepaid DLC content before the game's first anniversary. It launched in a rough state. Once more, the servers had difficulties as the update went live, but more damning than that were the issues you ran into once in the heist. Houston Breakout was full of bugs and immensely frustrating softlocks. In places, the heist appeared visually unfinished, and lighting issues on older heists such as Boys in Blue had somehow gotten worse. In the business of live service games though, quantity over quality seems to win out, as the game hit its highest peak player count in 2024, maxing out at 4,648 concurrent Steam players during its launch. Still far from a sustainable figure for the long-term future of the game, but undoubtedly progress. 3 days later, we were finally greeted with the game's revised roadmap after months of waiting, but that said more about the content that had already released than what was to come. It was a bit of a disappointment, although it confirmed the final DLC of Year 1 would be launching in September and that it would be a 2-part anniversary update that rolled into October, with massively requested features like the new CrimeNet UI also teased for later in the year. The only problem was, the content roadmap appeared to stop abruptly at the end of October, leaving some players wondering if more was planned for Year 2. We didn't have long to dwell on that thought though, as Fear and Greed entered its extended marketing cycle, hyping up a final showdown on Wall Street to cap off the Year 1 story. The game's second event, Stocked and Loaded, also took place in early September, giving players a chance to trade fictional Payday shares in the hope of winning a signed Wolf of Wall Street poster. This one seemed to go off without a hitch, although was entirely hosted outside of the game. On the 11th of September though, the community received a bombshell announcement that was delivered with very little fanfare. Mio would no longer be the game's director. Instead, that role will be shared by brand director Almir and lead producer Andreas, two long-standing community figures who still commanded a lot of respect from the community despite being the faces of the game's rocky launch. This was obviously a popular decision given the controversy still looming around Mio and the perception that these two Payday series veterans have the experience to move the game forward. As of now, we're still waiting to see their influence, but there has already been a slight but noticeable shift in player sentiment and Starbreeze's approach to comms. In fact, the almost immediate announcement of the Armor 2.0 system the following Friday helped bolster that improved sentiment even further. This blog announced the planned changes to Armor in Payday 3, targeting a December release date. The approach is to expand the current plate system, adding an endlessly rechargeable option, and making all three armor types entirely interchangeable, with new passives depending on how heavily you want to armor up. It seems like a fairly robust system which intends to take the best of Payday the Heist and 2's armor mechanics and evolve them for the more modern gameplay of Payday 3. I'm genuinely very excited to see how it plays once implemented, and I'm incredibly happy to see the concept shared with the community so early into the design process. It really raised the player base's spirits heading into DLC for Fear and Greed's release on the 16th of September. Once again, this heist went above and beyond what the base roster of heists were capable of in terms of scale and replayability, showing a real evolution of what a Payday 3 heist could be all about. Houston finally launched as a playable character for free with this update, alongside the first new overkill weapon, a widely adored minigun, which has single-handedly revived the forgotten system for the time being. More excellent free and paid cosmetics were also added, alongside a weapon pack including iconic weapons like the Spaz 12 and Desert Eagle, which were surefire winners in the community's eyes. Once again, this was a fantastic, packed update that was held back by needing to be rushed out the door, assumedly before the 18th. The heist released with nonsensical blue and red colour grading, ruining its aesthetic, cops are rocking up invisible, and half the time, crew AI simply aren't bothered to join in on the heist. There is a sense of wasted potential for Fear and Greed, however it doesn't seem the community minds these problems as much as I do, and I also need to point out that designers are listening to feedback actively. FAKs were made almost useless in the previous update, and they also made some unpopular changes to stealth mechanics, which were both addressed directly in 1.4.0. So whilst I hate to see content being clearly rushed out of the door, as it suggests the Payday 3 team isn't being resourced appropriately, if this is a short-term response to particularly crippling deadlines, I certainly won't hold it against them, and believe the overall direction they're moving in is a positive one. And it really seems like the wider community agrees with that sentiment. Despite losing the game from Game Pass on the 15th of September, the cross-platform sales currently taking place to compensate for that appear to have been highly successful. Whilst player numbers peaked on Steam at only 3,800 this month, that was to be expected, given it's the end of the summer holidays and Houston Breakout was bound to garner more attention. What's much more significant is that the daily peaks remain notably higher than what we've witnessed across recent months, hanging around that 3,000 number even a week after the update. The game has even hit a mixed review score on Steam, which feels like a massive turnaround from the review bombing at launch, although no one should get complacent about a 40% positive review score. Still, this has been a strong finish to the year, and whilst the numbers I'm discussing are still less than 5% of those experienced during that momentary launch peak when everything clicked into place, it is still a place of strength when you compare it to where we stood just a few months ago, when the daily peak was just 10% of what it is today. I find with video games such as this one, decisions are made on the back of momentum and trajectory swings. Payday 3 seems to have finally started to shake off the rust and that horrible reputation it was saddled with at launch. I still don't believe the game has managed to positively reach a more mainstream audience again, but at least core supporters of the franchise are starting to see the vision come together. Sadly, without tapping into a new audience successfully, who knows where the game will be by the time we reach its second anniversary. I still think just about any outcome is possible. Could be in maintenance mode by March, just as easily as it could be up and competing with the 20 to 30,000 current Steam player numbers we've seen from its predecessor over the years. Or we might still be cruising in the low thousands, wondering what the hell can come in year 3 to finally turn this sinking ship around. Smart money, as far as I'm concerned, would be to sit this one out. I'm not gambling on an outcome that seems as uncertain as Starbreeze were about their vision for this game. All I know is it's a hell of a lot better than it was 12 months ago, and it has room to grow exponentially from here, especially with so many highly requested additions known to be in the pipeline for Q4 of this year. So if you were wondering if a purchase is worth it, I think at the current sale price with all DLC, you may want to consider a gold edition if all these massive improvements have sold the game to you. Thank you so much for watching this video and sticking with me on the channel through what has been one of the toughest periods fans of this franchise have ever weathered. But there seems to be a light at the end of the tunnel, so just maybe I won't be here 12 months down the line dissecting where it all went wrong. We can hope at least. Have a great week, guys. Take care, I'll see you soon. A huge thank you to my dedicated Patreon backers. If you want to join this crew in going infamous, check out the link below and pledge as little as $2 to see your name in the credits, or get 24-hour early access to future videos and vote on upcoming content. Take care, I'll see you all soon.